Hey, Anne, do you have any plans on April 28th or April 29th?
I actually do, Ruby. I am going to be a speaker, which is like one of my favorite things to do.
Oh my goodness, me too. I'm going to be at the Seattle Reproductive Symposium.
That is where all the hip healthcare providers are going to be this April. So if you are one of our many listeners that is a provider, we want to share with you the opportunity to get in on that early bird pricing. Up through March 27th, you can sign up at a discounted rate, and it is such a great thing to give to the community.
That's right, and it's up to 11.5 AMA Category 1 credits, and there will be 5 of our previous guests from our podcast speaking. So Dr. Nicole Barker, Dr. Sarah De La Torre, Judy Simon, Laura Hayden, Kristen Chambliss, among many, many other wonderful guests.
And we have some hands-on workshops. So the Thursday before, there's an ovulation planning workshop, and that Saturday afternoon, there's a workshop all about doing IUIs or intrauterine insemination. So if you are a healthcare provider either in the Seattle area or interested in coming to the Seattle area in April to meet us, find the full agenda, register. Everything's online at seattlereproductivesymposium.com, and we are accredited and hosted by Seattle Reproductive Medicine.
Welcome to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
And I'm Ann Judge. The Whole Pineapple is a podcast about wellness focused around fertility. We'll talk with experts on a wide range of topics, including nutrition, stress relief, sleep, mental health, etc.
And we'll dig into the issues that can cause fertility challenges, like PCOS, or early menopause, or cancer treatment.
So if you're curious about your fertility, whether you're ready to start a family,
or you're preserving your options for the future, let's dig in. All right, everyone, we have a crossover today. So exciting. Yes, we are with somebody that has their own podcast, too.
I was told that like 1 in 4 Americans have a podcast. So it's actually more surprising if someone doesn't have one.
I know Spotify gives you your end of the year and you're like these top stats and you feel so fancy. And then I know other people with theirs and they're sharing. There's like, wait, we can't all be in the top 5%, can we? But maybe we are.
Yes, we are meeting today with Ellen Trackman, and she is the co-host of I Want to Put a Baby in You.
Yes, thank you so much for having us. And for your listeners, stay tuned because we're doing a crossover the other direction in the future. So you'll be coming on our podcast.
It's like that mythical back in the day when there was like Mad About You and Friends, and there was the big New York blackout and everybody appeared at everybody else's shows.
Like that, but even more exciting.
Well, let me go through this distinguished bio. Ellen has had like all the awards. Ellen Trackman is the founder and managing attorney at Trackman Law Center, LLC. She founded her firm in order to bring dedicated and compassionate legal representation to those wishing to build a family or to help others to build a family through assisted reproductive technology. Originally from northern New Mexico, Ellen entered undergrad at University of California, Berkeley, and law school at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. She co-founded the Colorado Fertility Advocates, a nonprofit group dedicated to supporting Colorado families and fertility advocates. She has received, like I said, all of the awards. Anne, are you ready for the list?
This will be the podcast. It's just...
And this will be the whole podcast, right? So. Ellen received the 2015 Entrepreneurial Woman of the Year Award from the Colorado LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce, the 2017 Volunteer of the Year Award from GLBT Community Center of Colorado. Hold on a second while I scroll. The 2018, she was named by Denver Business Journal as one of Denver's 40 under 40. Ah, okay, Ellen. All right.
They really should do the over 40 list too,
right?
right?
Like we can be accomplished.
They should, yeah.
In 2019, Ellen was a finalist of the Shining Star Award with the Society for Ethics in Egg Donation and Surrogacy, aka SEEDS. In 2020, Ellen was awarded with Ally of the Year by Colorado LGBT Bar Association. She writes weekly columns on assisted reproductive technology issues for Above the Law. And like I mentioned, co-hosts the podcast I Want to Put a Baby in You, in all of her spare time.
Yeah. Welcome.
Thank you. And do you mind if I just do a brief pitch of the podcast? Because I feel like for those who love your podcast, which is amazing and funny and informative, I hope that you could get a lot out of our podcast too. So as mentioned, it's called I Want to Put a Baby in You. We focus on all things assisted reproductive technology. And we have a really strong mix of professionals on, as well as people with interesting personal stories of whether they went through surrogacy surrogacy or egg or sperm donation. And our goal is to help people not feel alone. So really so many different ways families are formed. And if I just have to like say like a couple, we have over 150 episodes. Like there's a few that are absolutely my favorite. So one of them is Our Daughter is American Too. That's the title of the podcast with Derek Mize and Jonathan Gregg. As an attorney, I love following these really fascinating cases with assisted reproductive technology. And this poor, adorable couple, they come on and they tell the love story of how they met and their journey of becoming parents. And one, it's just told beautifully, where I was crying during the recording. But they also just had this crazy case where I feel like this should be a movie one day. So one of them grew up in England, and his college friend offered to be their surrogate. And they had this beautiful surrogacy journey where they moved into her little village while she was pregnant. But when their child was born and they came back to the United States, that's when they found out that the U.S. government was denying their daughter U.S. citizenship, despite both of them being U.S. citizens. It was mind-blowing. And we talk in detail about this provision of the immigration code and what happened and this really terrible interpretation of it. And they brought a lawsuit to have their daughter recognized as a U.S. citizen. And I go through kind of their story and these rulings, and ultimately, not to ruin the end, but they do ultimately have a judge rule in their favor multiple, because it was appealed. So the Court of Appeal judge rule in their favor that, of course, their daughter should be recognized as American, and the U.S. government under the previous administration was wrong to deny her citizenship. But it's a beautiful story with ups and downs. And so that is where I would start.
Well, I just can't even imagine having to go through all that on top of, taking care of a baby. Not you have a whole lot of spare time to sue the U.S. government. So
yeah, I mean, there was a whole rash of these cases that happened around the same time. And in one of them, there was twins. And I don't know if you guys saw the news on this one, because it was everywhere at the time, that the U.S. government denied U.S. citizenship to one of the twins, but not the other.
Oh, that makes a whole lot of sense.
Because of the paternity, right? Because one was a citizen and the other a father, or something.
I mean, they were born in Canada and they'd used an egg donor, but one father was genetically related to one and one was to the other. Yeah. And under the birth certificates, they both had the same parents. Under Canadian law, they were both, they both had the same parents. But the U.S. government was oh, no, we care about genetics, and therefore only one of you is a U.S. citizen.
Yeah. Well, that's why I was so excited to have you come on the podcast, because, I mean, we obviously think so many things about our field are interesting, but anytime you get into the legal part, that's when my brain just explodes. Because you just can't believe some of the scenarios people find themselves in. And I'm just curious, how did you end up finding this as a specialty? It seems like it's something that people don't always think about when they're just starting off a law school career.
Yeah, no. And I remember in law school when they said, raise your hand if you're doing litigation. Okay, put your hands down. Raise your hand if you're doing litigation. And those were your two choices. There weren't these crazy niche areas of cannabis law and assisted reproductive technology law. Naturally, I became a hedge fund attorney after law school. So I was living in San Francisco. And at the time, the area was really, really fascinating. And I loved my coworkers, but I didn't feel like it was a calling or that I really was making a difference in the world. In fact, I worried I might be making a negative difference in the world, possibly with hedge funds. I wasn't totally sure about that total impact.
That's how I feel about hedge funds in general. I'm just I'm not really sure.
Yes, right. I'm not sure it's a positive impact. But I was living with some friends of mine who were a gay couple. And at that same time, so they had been considering what their options were to be parents. And my sister at the time was going through her fertility journey, which she talks about very openly on our podcast, where they had been trying to conceive for years. I, around that time, had an opportunity to look at an egg donation contract, and my mind was blown. As a newer lawyer at that time, I had never realized this was an area of law with so many fascinating implications for real life implications for people and their families, and the law just not knowing how to handle so many situations. I was I need to do this. This is really interesting. But it was another 7 years or so before I was okay, I can quit my corporate job and just, go do what I want. But it took a lot to make that leap.
I mean, how do you even get the training for that? It's not like people offer internships in reproductive law.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly. Which is like, okay, how do I get the training? Like, I'm going to teach myself this on the side and I'll do this. And it was really hard to enter into the area. So ultimately, I ended up just quitting corporate and started reading every material I could, going to conferences on the topic, and just kind of diving headfirst into the area. But even I talked to a lot of law students who are interested in the area, or new attorneys, or even older attorneys who are interested. And it is hard to kind of get into like such a niche area and find the training.
I'm sure it's the same for other fertility clinics. Like we have a list of the law attorneys that we know have specialties in this because, like you said, it's not everybody knows all the intricate things that goes along with, say like a donor contract or a gestational carrier contract. There's a lot of things that a lot of times patients that are going into it, they're like, I just want a baby.
I get it. And for me as an attorney, I'm always terrified when they're like, our friend is an attorney. They're going to draft the contract for free because they care about us. And they practice some absolutely completely different area. And some of the terms I'll see in there, I'll be like, what?
Yeah.
So I know one, which I'm sure was a very smart attorney, clearly very skilled in the area they practice. But they drafted this contract, and I had never seen a sperm donation contract where it was like, he will come into the house, he will ejaculate, he will leave immediately. And I was like, what? Like, that's not what a sperm donation contract normally looks like. Like, I've never seen the word ejaculate in a sperm donation contract. Oh, okay. I mean, I get it, but it's not normally the language we use.
It is fascinating to me because I know we see sometimes patients where obviously this process can seem overwhelming and financially overwhelming too. And I see people that seem to think that legal is an area they can save money on. And that seems so backwards, of all the things that you want to get right. I mean, this is protecting your future family and not the kind of thing you want to just download a template from the internet and hope that it works. So
I get a lot of pushback because we have to walk this line as providers where we want to be protecting our patients, but also like not setting up too many barriers for them either. And it happens a lot with my LGBTQIA patients where they're like, well, went on the website and I got this contract, like, here's our legal contract. Why are you saying now I have to get an attorney and get this signed? That's more expense. This is delaying my cycle. Like, this seems like an unfair barrier for us, but it's like, it's also very important. And we'll talk about some of that reasons why.
I am very understanding and compassionate of those, especially medical providers who feel terrible at how expensive this process is. But I've certainly seen a situation where in one case, looks like a fertility doctor accepted an online contract. And then I got the call so it was a surrogacy arrangement where they had done an online contract, which is mind-blowing that made it through. But they called from the hospital. I didn't even think this situation was real initially because he's like, the hospital's asking for a court order, a parentage. What are they talking about? And I'm just like, how did you get to the hospital? How did you get to the birth without talking to an attorney and knowing that there is this process to have intended parents legally recognized? And it's a process of the courts that we have to go through. So please talk to the attorneys early on.
Yeah.
And it's so hard because it's so different by state. I mean, that's the other hard part. And so sometimes I don't think, especially if people are using gestational carrier that lives in a state that's different than they are, they may not realize that, and especially if you're using someone that you know. I think that's the hard part. No one ever wants to think that anyone that you are, important in your life could ever have bad intentions in the future. But life is just so uncertain and you don't know what could come up. And I know it's the longer I work here, you always think you've heard the story that is like, that can't, and then something always comes around to top it. So.
And those are the ones where we do see more likely things to blow up or go wrong, where it's like, oh, it's my friend, it's my relative, like we trust them. And then you just don't go through the process that you need to, and you're not on the same page necessarily, and that comes out.
So what is, for listeners, what do you think is the basic minimum that anyone that's doing ART needs to be aware of in terms of the legal? Because I think even for patients that are using their own gametes, people often don't even read the forms they're signing, even though it goes into questions about... I was just going to
say, is it bad that I look up my consent and I'm like, signed, done?
Divorce, death, all these things that no one likes to think about. But if you're making embryos with somebody, you really want to understand what you're agreeing to.
Yes. And I beg to listeners to please pay attention to those options, because maybe it won't happen to you, but it happens to a lot of people, and that could be you. So please think carefully about those decisions. But I'm guilty of it too. Like I'll rent a car and sign. I don't know what I'm signing to, right?
An Apple update. You're like,
terms of service. Yeah, click. Let me get past this.
How did I get Spotify on my on my rental car?
Exactly. But for those consent forms that you are given at a clinic, those decisions in terms of what happens in the case of a divorce, what happens in the case of, like, those are really important decisions. And I can't tell you how often it's a divorce or a death, and I'm dealing with an aggrieved person who did not check what was important to them, that they weren't paying attention to that. Maybe the spouse checked, maybe someone else checked, and they just signed and weren't paying attention. But really do think about what you would want and what's important to you. Would you want to be able to have use of embryos if your spouse were to die? And I will say, especially in that area of death, the number of times that I've had someone come to me and they really want to conceive using the genetics or the embryos of their past loved one, and there just wasn't clear consent, is heartbreaking. The area is very gray in the United States where there's not a lot of law on point, but without a clear consent, it makes it very, very hard to move forward. I know it's not a natural conversation, but I encourage everyone, maybe this Valentine's Day, to have this romantic conversation of like, hey, if you died, can I have your sperm or eggs? Like just have the conversation, see how they feel. Go ahead, write it down on a napkin and sign it, because that would be at least something for me to show a court. Like, please just show your intentions. And it's really hard. Even like separate from going through IVF, it happens that people die where they don't have eggs or sperm retrieved from their body. But that is something that is medically possible if you can convince a medical provider or show a court quickly enough that you have rights to receive their eggs or sperm to use for conception.
And that actually happened to me on a couple occasions when I was working the weekend. So weekend back when I was there was like skeleton crew, and on 2 occasions I had, one was a mother that called and her son had passed away tragically. And then one was a wife that called and they want to do posthumous sperm extraction, but there was no indication that that's what that person wanted. And it was heartbreaking. And who knows, it very well could have been where he could have been like, yes, absolutely, that's what I want. But we don't have that now. And it was just so tragic and heartbreaking to have those conversations.
The worst part is there is probably a good probability that if they were alive to say, they'd be like, yes, of course, I want to support, what you want after my death. But because they never had that conversation, they never expressed it in a way that we can access now, we don't have any written form of their consent.
And I think the hard part about consents too is, not only do people not necessarily, get them when they might for these hard conversations, but I think people also don't realize the limits to the consents that you sign in a clinic, because people can still challenge those. Like, even if you sign that this is what's going to happen when you divorce, if you actually divorce and someone changes their mind, it's not as clear as just what the contract says, right? Then you set up this battle. So how does that work? 'Cause I feel like that's also an area that is shifting now a little bit post-Dobbs, in terms of some states now wanting to favor use of embryos regardless of what prior wishes might have been.
Excellent point. I don't want to minimize how important the contracts and the consents are, because having that written proof of your intention is really important for any battle that you might have to come, the fact that it's documented. But yes, it's not the end all to everything. And especially as laws are evolving, and especially post-Dobbs, we certainly see a patchwork of how embryos might be treated or gametes might be treated. So, for example, in Louisiana, embryos are considered as juridical persons with the right to sue and be sued.
What was that word again?
Juridical, a juridical person, like a legal person.
Wow, I've never heard juridical. Okay.
Juridical, yeah.
I'm going to work that into a conversation.
Yeah, definitely. See if you can use juridical naturally during the day today. So embryos can sue and be sued and have this status of personhood to some level in Louisiana. So you can't discard embryos in Louisiana. You only have disposition choices of using for conception for yourself or donating to others for conception purposes because of the status of embryos as juridical persons.
And that's a little teaser for our snack too, because in our snack, we're going to really get into more, but I'm so fascinated. I can't not talk about it. So yes, if you're finding that interesting, our snack is going to be like, wait, if I have embryos, how worried do I need to be about these state to state variations? So we will definitely get into that more.
I'm going to save the more examples for the snack. Yes. Excellent.
Well, when it comes to like consent, this actually came up for one of my patients not too long ago. There's a lesbian couple. They were going through donor sperm insemination with a non-directed donor, so a donor from a sperm bank. They did several cycles, didn't get pregnant, and then went through divorce. Hadn't heard from them for a while, went through divorce. They had one remaining sperm vial left. And I get a call from the partner who the sperm was not in their name, very concerned that if her ex-partner were to conceive with that vial, can they sue me for child support and things like that? And at our clinic, we have to have a divorce decree before people can proceed with treatment and things like that. But it did take me a minute. I'm like, well, let me think this through and make sure that we're doing all the things that we need to do, because there's questions.
Well, we had a patient a while ago where, again, we have multiple offices, and someone came in to establish care, said they were single, that they wanted to start doing donor inseminations. We happen to have a medical assistant that recently came to us from working at another fertility clinic. And she was like, I know her. She and her husband are patients at this other clinic down the road. And and so we kind of got her alone. And so she was legally married, but it was male factor. And she was kind of sort of like, you know what, I'll just go do this myself. But legally, like if she had showed up pregnant back at clinic 1 from her donor sperm cycle, it was
child support.
Yeah. And you just don't like to think that these things could happen, but man, they can.
So I didn't see patients who were pretending they were single, but we definitely saw a lot of issues, especially during COVID, where being quarantined together, you're like, maybe I need to reassess my life and my priorities. But a number of patients who were going through fertility treatment and didn't necessarily want to be with their spouse anymore, but were really in a rough position legally to go forward, because under most states' laws, a spouse is presumed a legal parent of a child born during the marriage, or in some states for like 300 days after the marriage. And it's irrelevant if you use donor sperm. There's still this presumption of legal parentage and presumptions of like needing to support that child. So really adds to the complications, not to mention that the spouse may have property rights to donor sperm you receive or embryos you form during that marriage.
Now, does Louisiana's law only apply to embryos? Like if you had sperm or eggs, do those have any special status in the eyes of the law, or those are just property?
So I am not licensed in Louisiana. Colorado, New Mexico, Montana, and California are my 4 states, especially where I'm licensed. But I am not aware of Louisiana giving personhood or special rights to sperm or eggs at this point.
Well, so going back a little bit to, if people are using donor gametes, and especially if they are in a same-sex relationship, like what is the difference between the contracts and the things that you do before you get pregnant versus what you have to do after a child is born in terms of making sure that everything is on the up and up legally?
Definitely different scenarios depending on what you're going through as your assisted reproduction technology, your fertility journey. It's very common that someone might use donor eggs or donor sperm, and especially for same-sex couples, there may be a presumption of parentage for both parents at birth. So, for example, if I was married to a woman and I used donor sperm from a clinic or a bank, it might be that I'm not signing a lot of legal documents. I'm just signing consents, and then I get to birth and I'm a birthing parent, so I'm presumed a legal parent, and my spouse is presumed a legal parent, and we're both on the birth certificate, so I think I'm good. But you might be good, but you might not. And there is unfortunately this growing body of case law in various states, Oklahoma, Idaho, etc., where we see same-sex couples who conceived in this way and didn't take steps to further recognize their parentage. So there is this understanding, at least among attorneys in this area, that a birth certificate is considered an administrative document, but not entitled to full faith and credit. So even though you're both on the birth certificate, other states do not have to recognize you as a legal parent. However, if you have a court order, that is entitled to full faith and credit, and that would protect you throughout the country. So there is this prevailing legal advice that you should be getting a court order and taking further steps to protect your parentage. Some states make that easier than others. So in Colorado, where I reside, in the last couple of years, our House Majority Leader, Representative Danae Esgar, she and her wife had a child together. And when they talked to an attorney, they were absolutely horrified and offended by this legal process that, they don't see straight couples having to go through. And so, the fact that they were having to go through fingerprinting and a hearing to protect their parental rights were incredibly offensive. So in our state, Representative Esgar introduced this bill to create, which ultimately was named after their daughter, so it's called Marlowe's Law, that created a simplified, what we call confirmatory adoption for parents through assisted reproduction. So really, like, no fingerprinting, no hearing, the donor doesn't have to consent, et cetera. This very simplified process to get a court order, still under the adoption code, recognizing you as a legal parent. So California has it. I know Colorado has it. A few other states have confirmatory adoption.
Washington's still surprisingly a state that has some hoops that you're like, really? Like, you have to have a home visit for that? Laura Hayden talks about that in her episode back last June. I don't know what number it was, but she's a social worker that basically that's what she does, is counsel people on like their home visits and jumping through the hoops for that confirmatory adoption process.
So, I mean, even if you're in a state where you're jumping through hoops, it's definitely recommended that you go through that so you're not later in a position where someone's questioning that you're not a legal parent. And in some cases, where the birthing parent is also the genetic parent, it's very clear who's legally at risk. But in other cases, it's not so clear, especially couples who go through co-maternity or reciprocal IVF, where the eggs come from one person, but the other party is carrying. So one has a genetic connection, one is the birthing parent. And, I always laugh. There was this, not laugh because it's terrible, but there was this case from Michigan where a couple went through exactly that. They went through reciprocal IVF. They weren't married, but they raised these twins together for 7 years. And then they, no longer were together, and they'd gone to a custody dispute, and it went before a court. And the court declared one of them not a legal parent.
Who did the court pick? I don't know. I don't know who they're going to pick.
Exactly. So even when I present this to an attorney, they're like, they might have an inclination, but they might be wrong just because it could go either direction. What are your guesses?
I'm going to guess birth because I feel like the law lags behind with an understanding of genetics.
Yeah, I was going to say birth because I think you could argue like the adoption. That's my choice, birth.
That the birth parent is the legal parent.
Yeah.
You're both wrong.
Wow.
And I think that is the natural. I feel like if you were an attorney, that would be your inclination as well. And that most states would choose the birthing parent. So in this case, and especially where Michigan considers surrogacy, so compensate surrogacy is illegal.
Michigan is ground zero of all the surrogacy, baby M, all that stuff.
Yeah, of anti-surrogacy. So they declared the birthing mom a surrogate.
Wow.
Which is crazy.
A surrogate for your own children.
Oh, wow.
Yes, clearly she was not a surrogate. Clearly she was carrying her own children. So luckily, places like the National Center for Lesbian Rights got involved and helped with the appeal, and they were able to get that overturned. But it was like a year where one of the mothers was declared not a legal parent of her own children, but only a surrogate. Absolutely crazy.
Oh my gosh. So let's talk a little bit about because surrogacy, I do feel like is where we get into the most
it's
of,
its own
and obviously
animal.
We could talk about that for episodes and episodes, but sort of maybe even start a little bit with Michigan, because I think that for a lot of people was the first time that people in the main world even realized that there was a thing called a surrogate and that you could end up with custody issues after the fact. And that really has shaped how our policies and laws are all over the U.S.
Absolutely. And I always laugh because this woman I worked with for a while and was on our podcast, she tells the story about how she became a surrogate. And she talks about the baby M case, which of course was this horrible case where genetic surrogate or traditional surrogate, the woman was genetically related to the child, but she changed her mind and ran away with the baby. So they were in New Jersey and she kidnapped the child and went to Florida. And, there were some really bad facts where I think she left this message saying, if I can't have the baby, no one can.
Oh
and
gosh.
Really terrible.
Oh,
but so
dear.
the New Jersey court ended up declaring that surrogacy was this really terrible thing, and they outlawed surrogacy for a while. That's been reversed since then. Susie White, who's on our podcast, tells a story about watching on Oprah or some talk show about the baby M case being presented, and that was what inspired her to become a surrogate.
Wow.
Oh, interesting.
Whenever you say like, oh, no, no news is bad news. I don't know what,
Any
no media is bad media. Exactly. Like even the bad publicity sometimes works out. Whereas laughing that like this terrible surrogacy case.
I could see it though. Like, I want to offer this service the right way, to have people feel secure in that they will actually get this child out of this situation.
Yeah. So surrogacy law, still very much varies from state to state of how the law treats it, how they recognize legal parents, who they're willing to recognize as legal parents. So, for example, in Colorado, where it's very pro-surrogacy, the law is very clear that it looks to the intentions of the parents and that you could do a donated embryo and a surrogate or donate egg and sperm and a surrogate, and you could still be legally recognized as parents, while other states might require that at least one of the parents has a genetic connection to the child. But Michigan is not the same at all. So Michigan still outlaws compensated surrogacy. In fact, it has criminal implications if you were to be involved in a compensated surrogacy arrangement. So while most states have become pro-surrogacy, Michigan has remained in this anti-surrogacy state. And there's been a lot of stories of really an effort to try to change the Michigan law where one very publicized case was a couple where she went through cancer and this wonderful woman offered to carry her children for her. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you look to surrogacy for, to help someone be able to become a mother or a parent, and they just can't do so themselves. And there's wonderful people offering to help them. But in their case, I think it was maybe 2 or more years before the actual parents, so the genetic and intended parents, were legally recognized as the parents of their own children because Michigan was so anti-surrogacy. And for most others, they have to leave the state or go somewhere else and look to other places for support.
Washington State, it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, it's recent.
Because remember, all of our patients went to go to Oregon?
Because it was the same sort of thing. You could be a compassionate surrogate. So again, it was you couldn't receive financial compensation. And again, pregnancy is a hard deal, and there are people that, goodness of their heart, but it's almost always going to be when you do have a friend or a sister or someone. But to be able to have someone that's not close to you do this, I mean, that's very hard to find that without being able to offer some sort of financial support. So,
which is absolutely ideal if you have that friend or sister.
Right.
Just some people just don't have that amazing friend or sister offering to help them.
This for me, one of my jobs in the clinic is reviewing records for potential gestational carriers. And I will say the problem is that friend or sister may not be a good candidate. And that's the hard part, because people come in and they're like, I'm all set. So-and-so's agreed to be my surrogate. And someone can be lovely, but not necessarily be a good candidate for having a healthy pregnancy. And there can be social as well as medical reasons for that. And that's a very tough situation for people when the alternative is something that we know is very expensive.
It's so hard.
And you still need contracts, even if it's a family member.
Yes,
because, man, that is still at our clinic, and I don't know if it's standard across the country or not, but we have everybody that's going to be involved in the process has to sit down with one of our counselors and go through, make sure no one's being coerced and all of that kind of stuff, because there's a lot of things you think, oh, we're such good friends, or, our family member's super tight, but you never really know.
I like the way that we do our screenings and the fact that when I'm reviewing records, I'm reviewing them for people that I don't know, because I think the problem is when you're a fertility doctor and you get in, you've been with this couple and this whole journey and they finally decided to use a surrogate and you know how hard that was for them. And they say, well, my cousin, and you're so invested in wanting it to work out that you have sometimes these blind spots where I'll be like, well, here are my concerns. And their primary provider will be like, that's okay. And so we always, you want that clear set of eyes to be like, hey, without any emotional investment in this case, is this really going to be the best situation? And
yeah, so there's medical and ethical and legal considerations when it comes to third party. And
it's so frustrating and hard that, of course, only so many people are willing to raise their hand to be a surrogate for someone else. But then, I know the statistics are like 1 to 5% maybe that qualify of all those that volunteer to be surrogates. It's really difficult to fall within those perfect parameters of being the right age, having perfect pregnancies, all the things that have the BMI has to be right, etc. No medical complications separate from pregnancy as well that would disqualify you.
One of our nurse practitioners actually here was a surrogate. So we should have her on the podcast actually to talk about her experience.
Yes. And our podcast has many surrogates on.
Yeah, if you want surrogate stories.
Yes, definitely.
So what are your big things that you'd want people who are listening to know when it comes to the law on surrogacy? I mean, obviously you could talk for a really long time, but what's the most important? Or just the most scary?
Please. I mean, attorneys, I swear we are your friends. Like, we want to help you. We want to help you figure things out from the beginning, but especially because there is so much variance in surrogacy from state to state. I mean, one thing that's really important to note is that the jurisdiction, so the state where your surrogate is often the most important. So you might think, oh, I live in California, it's so great and pro surrogacy, but your surrogate's in Michigan, right? So then it's a no-go. That won't work. So really trying to talk to an attorney from the beginning, especially an attorney where the surrogate lives, to make sure that that is a feasible option. A lot of it's within the United States. We also work with a lot of intended parents from abroad, and it becomes like a whole other level of complication if you're dealing with another country. So in some countries, there's often multiple legal processes where you have to go through to maybe after you're recognized as parents in the United States, then you need to be recognized as parents in your home country. And those can vary and may not be consistent with the United States law. For example, my article this past week, I was writing about this really horrific case out of Israel, where in the United States, this Israeli single woman had gone through surrogacy, and she also had used a donor egg and a donor sperm. Obviously, this isn't most people's first choice. That there tends to be medical reasons that you've gone to this. Often adoption's not a feasible option because you're on a list for 10 years or whatever the reason might be. But she goes home to Israel with her child, and there is just not a clear legal path for her to be recognized under Israeli law. So in this, ultimately, the Israeli Supreme Court ruling, they did provide her specifically a path to legal parentage, but they announced that anyone else through surrogacy without a genetic connection to the child, regardless of how you might be recognized as a parent in a different country, so like the country where the child was born, would not have a legal path to parentage in Israel. And in those cases, that means that the child is not an Israeli citizen. They have to live off a tourist visa that renews every few months. You're subject to deportation, possibly. I mean, it really is a scary situation where you are not being legally recognized as having a parent-child relationship. You're not being recognized as a citizen in the country you live, etc. So really talking to attorneys at the beginning, where your surrogate lives, where you live, if you're in a different country, getting a local attorney to talk to you about what the implications are for your country as well.
What's the adoption law in Israel?
I don't know the details of the adoption law, but I did talk for this article. I was talking to this Israeli legal expert, an attorney there, Victoria Gelfand, and she was saying that adoption is very, very difficult in the country.
Yeah, I imagine it sounds like it would be similar, like the verbiage that they're using seems like it's very similar.
It's interesting. She was also giving context to this case. So in Israel, the state actually provides funding for IVF. So if you fall within certain parameters, then the state, the government's going to pay for you to go through treatment and possibly even through surrogacy, which is amazing. Most countries aren't like that. But she talks about the context of this society where it is so part of the value of you as a person is, have you had children? Have you provided your parents' grandchildren? And then to make it so difficult for people who might have disabilities or face other obstacles to become legal parents and to live within that society just adds to this problem of people who desperately do want to be parents.
Not everybody follows surrogacy as closely as we do, obviously. And so when the pandemic happened and all of a sudden travel shut down, I mean, it was amazing to see all the media stories of all of these situations where suddenly, I don't think people had an awareness of international surrogacy until you suddenly had babies born without the legal parents able to get there and do anything about it, including surrogates who live in the US, because, there are a limiting and continue to be less places in the world that you can have surrogacy. I think people often think about people having a surrogate who lives overseas, but they don't realize how commonly people from overseas are coming to the US to do surrogacy.
And that's very frequently. I mean, we're one of the countries that allows certain kinds of surrogacy, especially. So in Europe, you could go to Russia or Ukraine previously.
Well, you could.
Yeah, previously. But you had to be a heterosexual married couple to have those options. So especially for same-sex couples, for gay men, the United States tends to be their one and only option for many.
Yeah, could you imagine being an intended parent or a surrogate in March of 2020 and you're like 9 months pregnant or something?
There were
like
the stories about it, like this, woman in Utah that gave birth and had that baby for months, which was not her plan at all because the intended parents were from China and they just could not get over here.
Or the other direction where, a couple of the United States was working with a surrogate in Ukraine and the war started. I mean, there's lots of complications that occur.
Oh my goodness. See?
So if you have the friend or the sister, that's ideal.
And I know we talked a lot about surrogates. I think the other time that friend stuff comes in, we mentioned it a little bit earlier, was with known donor situations for either egg or sperm. So any other big legal contract warnings there about why that is also super important in terms of making very clear what is and isn't a right. Especially if you want that person to be in your life later, because it's like, oh, they're going to kind of be like Uncle so-and-so, and we want them to know each other. But how do you make very clear that Uncle so-and-so doesn't have any rights legally?
Yes. Gray is a difficult color when it comes to law.
I am a very big fan of known donation. And I think that there still is for many a misconception that there's just so much more protection if you use an unknown donor. That's not true. Often it's like, oh, I feel safe that I don't know who this person is, or they might not know who I am. But we all know as technology advances and DNA testing and facial recognition software that boop, 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 people find each other. Yeah, and I don't think it necessarily makes it better not to know each other from the forefront.
Yeah, there's no anonymous anymore.
So better to have a legal contract to talk through these issues. Because so many of those, where it's unknown, you're just like, I sign off, and there's like very little conversation about what your wants or your intentions are for contact, for disclosure. So aside from just being better, it's very important to have these conversations and to put it down into writing what your plans are. So, big issues that come up with donation arrangements are disposition. So if I donate eggs to someone, am I comfortable with them using embryos formed from my eggs to discard, to donate to others, to donate to research, and especially the donating to others. So, maybe I thought I was just helping you, but I don't necessarily want to help 6 other families that I don't necessarily know. So having that control. Then other questions are disclosure. So we're seeing a lot of movement of voices of donor-conceived people being heard that they do really want to have access to information. So medical information, identity information, that is their biological history. So really trying to encourage parents to understand those wants and needs of many donor-conceived people and try to protect those rights that it's very possible that my child will want to know who their donor is. Like right now, I just want to be a parent, right? But I really should be thinking down the line about what's best for my child and protecting the ability to have that information, to have medical information that could be very important to them later.
Yeah, and on the side of the known donor, too, you want to be able to protect yourself. So if you don't want to be involved in that child's life or you don't want to be financially responsible, it's very important to lay this stuff out.
Not to keep pitching how important attorneys are. We're so important.
Yeah.
But understanding that, the law in most states is supportive of egg and sperm donation. And in some states, it requires the supervision of a licensed physician or other medical professional. While in other states, it's not required. So knowing in your state, like, am I okay if I decide to do a home insemination? Is that a possibility to still have legal protection? Or am I not legally protected? And there's, been some pretty shocking examples where it does make a difference. So in one case out of Kansas, so Kansas law requires the supervision of a licensed physician, and a couple, same-sex couple, found a donor on Craigslist. Always, Craigslist is always trouble, right? But they entered a contract, and then later, they had a child. One of the mothers was on disability, and the state went looking for, financial resources, and they found the donor, and they demanded that he pay child support. So even, I feel like that situation is so important to understand that even if, I trust my donor's my friend, like I would never come after them for child support, and I know he would never ask for parental rights, but it might not be you that's the issue. It might be 100% the government that's like, you didn't follow the law and we're the ones saying that there's a problem, even though you might agree. So that's another reason why it's so important to talk to the attorneys. And then let me just point out one other thing. So even though states are generally supportive of egg and sperm donation, I can't speak for every law, but every law I know of does require there to be assisted reproductive technology involved. So in other words, no sexual intercourse, that does not count as a donation under the law. So I did have a fellow attorney telling me a story that there was a known donor arrangement and the donor came to provide sperm specimens to the clinic, but they decide to, have sex during, around that time. And then later there was a determination that he was a legal parent because they couldn't be sure that the conception came from the sperm donated to the clinic versus through sexual intercourse, which would not be within the law supporting donation.
Well, one extra, I think I may have even said this when we talked before. I always love it when the lawyers speak at conferences because they have the best stories. And so, yeah, one of the conferences years ago, he was telling a similar story, except again, same thing. They did not, per his telling, have any kind of relationship, but they were friends and she was doing IVF. And so he was her ride home after egg retrieval, and they were out of state. So they were in a hotel together, and she claims that they had intercourse the night of her egg retrieval. And he claims they didn't, but she's pregnant with his genetic, and it turned into a big thing because it was a he said, she said, where they did have proof that they had been in a hotel together. And it gets these things you don't think anyone will ever do, but it's
different hotel, separate. You got to protect yourself.
Oh my gosh. Well, there was that one gentleman I think he was out of LA that was I think Craigslist donor kind of thing. And the amount of people that he would go visit.
Yeah, I read that article.
To donate or ship for I was like, this is in different states and stuff. I'm like, oh man, this is messy in more than one way.
And that was his preferred method, is I'll show up and I can provide a file. But, he told the women that the odds are better if we do it the old fashioned way too. So yeah, it just makes your skin crawl.
I mean, there's a couple, but I think that is one that came on our podcast. So there is a donor that goes by the name Kyle Gordy, and he did come on as a guest on our podcast several years ago. As the attorney, it was very hard. We're trying to understand this different perspective that, different people play different roles in this world of helping complete families. And I remember at one point I did ask him the question. So it's in recording, so you can listen to the podcast episode where I asked him, do you sign a contract with your recipients? And I think he told this story about how, one recipient tried to make me sign a contract, but I just signed a fake name. And I was like,
now that everyone is freaked out beyond imagination, let's, bring it up to the Dobbs decision in our next snack episode. But, legal stuff is very interesting. I think basically the long story short, the message is just make sure you're protecting yourself, have an attorney look at things, because there are areas that you might not actually even recognize could be a potential issue in the future.
I mean, of all the things to try and save money on, it's this is not one. You want to really know what you're signing or what you should be having people sign to really protect your future family.
I know it's one more cost, but I have to say the attorneys are actually not that bad in this area. This is not the big money maker. I don't make my big hedge fund bucks back in the day. Any attorney that really practices in assisted reproductive technology probably charges a flat fee. So you can find out up front exactly how much they charge for a contract or recommendations in the area. And you can call a few and find out what those flat rates are, but don't skip the step of finding a good attorney to help you.
And that's a good question. How do you know if somebody is a good fit for reproductive law when you're looking for an attorney?
There are websites that certainly list qualified attorneys or attorneys that are in the area. So, one resource I love, there's this agency called Creative Family Connections, and they have a beautiful surrogacy map that they keep updated, where you click on any state and it will give you an outline of what the law is in that state. And then at the bottom, it lists various attorneys that are licensed in that state who practice in assisted reproductive technology. Similarly, there is Quad A, or the Academy of Adoption and Assisted Reproductive Technology attorneys. So that has a directory for attorneys in different states who are either adoption or assisted reproductive technology specialized. And they do vetting, and you have to be admitted as a fellow. You've had to have so many cases in the area to be qualified to be listed. So that's a good resource as well.
Our clinic probably knows somebody in the area.
And they probably know who they like. That's like the patients speak well of and, help get things done well.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This is such an interesting topic, and be sure to tune in on Saturday to listen to more of this fascinating legal stuff. And just be sure to sign your consents and read your consents before you sign them.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Whole Pineapple Podcast. We hope it was helpful.
If you know someone who could benefit from hearing the podcast, we hope you'll share it with them.
And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review The Whole Pineapple on your favorite podcast app. Every rating and review makes us easier to find.
This podcast is sponsored by Seattle Reproductive Medicine and is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. We'll see you next time. Have a delicious week.